Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to my show. At the end of this March, we witnessed a chain of tweets. The tweet was actually talking about a zero-day vulnerability, and people in cyber defense community comparing this vulnerability with Log4Shell. They also kept the name for this vulnerability similar to Log4Shell. So by hearing this introduction, you might have guessed it. Yeah, I'm talking about Spring4Shell vulnerability. Spring4Shell is the flaw that we have been dealing with for past few days. And a week ago, TryHackMe came up with a room that explains the Spring4Shell vulnerability at higher level. So I'm going to walk through that specific room in this video. So we are going to learn some higher level stuff related to Spring4Shell. Without wasting the time, let's begin. This is the specific TryHackMe room that I was talking about, Spring4Shell CVE-2022-22965. And that is the CVE we are talking about. Interactive Lab for Exploiting Spring4Shell in Java Spring Framework. And in this room, they gave their machine, which is vulnerable for Spring4Shell. And we can use the exploit that they gave here in this download file. And we can download the exploit and try against their machine itself. And if you see the topic, it is totally simple, just introduction and deploy and vulnerability background they gave. And all you need is to understand the reason for this vulnerability and what this vulnerability is all about. And the exploitation pace is very, very simple. It hardly takes few seconds to exploit and eventually a conclusion, a small part. Okay, now let's move to the introduction part. In late March 2022, two remote code execution vulnerabilities in Java Spring Framework were made public. And they are talking about Java Spring Framework. If you have no idea about the Spring Framework, you can simply Google what is Spring Framework. And the definition gives the Spring Framework is an application framework and inversion of control container for the Java platform. The framework's core features can be used by any Java application, but there are extensions for building web applications on top of the Java EE platform. So here in this line, they are mentioning the framework's core features can be used by any Java application. Actually, this specific point makes the Spring Framework vulnerability very notorious because since this specific framework is being used by most of the Java application, we are considering the Spring4Shell vulnerability is ubiquitous. Okay, now they gave the URL as well. The specific link is redirecting to the Spring Framework's official page, and this is the official page of the Spring Framework. You can go through this page if you want to know more about this. And in this video, we are going to cover this vulnerability at higher level, as I said before. And the first of these vulnerabilities affect a component of the framework called Spring Cloud Function. So there are two vulnerabilities, but we are going to talk about only one of that vulnerabilities. And that vulnerability is very vital and crucial. And the first vulnerability found in the Spring Cloud Function, and the second vulnerability is what we are going to discuss. And this is found in the Spring Core. Actually, this is the core component of that Spring framework. And it significantly increases the vulnerability's potential impact and earning it the name Spring4Shell. So they are simply comparing this vulnerability with Log4Shell because of its ubiquity. And for various reasons, there has been a lot of confusion surrounding these vulnerabilities in the wider InfoSec community. As such, this room may be updated as new information comes to the light. So they are trying to clarify this vulnerability as much as they can. So this room will provide an overview of Spring4Shell remote code execution vulnerability in Spring Core, as well as it will give us an opportunity to exploit the vulnerability and try to understand the vulnerability better. So this is all about the introduction. This is just an information. So I'm completing this. I already spawned the machine. And the next thing we are going to see is the vulnerability background. So if I see the overview of this vulnerability, Spring4Shell was originally released as a zero-day, is now deleted thread of tweets. Actually, they tweeted this vulnerability and they removed the tweet actually. and it was quickly identified as a bypass of the patch for CVE-2022-22965. And this is the ancient vulnerability detected in Spring framework, and this vulnerability has so many similarities with the current Spring4Shell vulnerability. And you have to understand this vulnerability as well before getting to know this Spring4Shell. And a vulnerability in earlier version of Spring framework which allowed attackers to obtain remote code execution by abusing the way in which Spring handles the data sent to the HTTP request. So what they are trying to explain in this line. So here in this vulnerability, the remote attacker try to manipulate the data that they are sending to the Spring framework. The web server made with the Spring framework. And in short, the vulnerability allows attackers to upload the web shell. So here is the short explanation. So they are uploading the web shell uh, by manipulating this vulnerability and achieving the remote code execution. In the bracket, they gave the explanation for the web shell, a piece of code which accepts commands from attackers that the web server is then tricked into executing. All right. Now let's see how does it work in a brief manner. To understand Spring4Shell, it is important that we understand CVE 20101622, and they gave a component name here. So pay the attention here. Spring MVC, Model View Controller, is part of the Spring framework, which makes it easy to develop web application following the MVC design pattern. So this is one of the components of Spring Core framework, and it helps to develop the web application. And one of these features of the Spring MVC is that it automatically instantiates and populates an objects of a specified class when a request is made based on the parameters sent to the endpoint. So here they gave one of the properties of this Spring MVC, and in simple terms, this could be abused. Actually, they are abusing this specific property of the Spring MVC to exploit to execute the code in remote. And Spring4Shell works along similar lines, bypassing the mitigations that were added to patch the ancient vulnerability. And the majority of the exploits for the Spring4Shell vulnerability operate by forcing the application to write the malicious JSP file. JSP is nothing but Jakarta server pages, and it effectively a plain text Java file, and which the Tomcat can execute. Tomcat, if you have no idea what is Tomcat, then obviously we can get the help from the Google. What is Apache Tomcat? So let's see the definition here. Apache Tomcat is a free and open source implementation of Jakarta servlet. We already seen the term Jakarta in the JSP definition, and Jakarta expression language, and also the WebSocket technologies. Tomcat provides a pure Java-based HTTP web server. So the Tomcat is simply a web server that is made up of Java, and they are simply explaining what is JSP file within this explanation. The sentence that present within this bracket. And effectively, it is plain text Java which Tomcat can execute, much like PHP web server. If you see any PHP web server, you will be able to witness the list of PHP files added into the web server. So what the web server, PHP server would usually do, it will simply parse those PHP files and it will create the HTML file. In similar way, the specific Tomcat web server, what it will do, it will simply parse this .jsp file and it will create the HTML file, and it renders that HTML file to the web request that it receives. And this web shell can then be executed to gain remote command execution over the target. All right, so they simply gave a higher level and a very brief explanation for this function. And the limitations, it also has some limitations. Though this vulnerability is considered to be ubiquitous, there are some advantages. Not advantages, there are some fortunate things in this vulnerability. So let me try to explain that. Fortunately, despite how commonly the Spring framework is, the conditions in which the vulnerability can be exploited are actually fairly limited. So there are some certain criteria for any server, any Spring framework, the server which has the Spring framework, to be vulnerable. And the Spring4Shell vulnerability affects Spring core before the version, and also there are some version restriction. And apart from that, it is running the Java development kit version which is greater than or equal to 9. If your JDK version is less than 9, then you you are not probably vulnerable to this. And the publicly available exploits currently available only work on applications deployed on Apache Tomcats as WAR. WAR means web archives. And in order to deploy this Apache Tomcat web server, there are certain techniques. And if the web server Tomcat is deployed by using the method web archive, then only the specific vulnerability is applicable. And however, the Spring framework maintainers have stated that they believe there may be other ways to exploit this vulnerability, but those other ways are still undetected. And here are the conditions they gave here one by one. Your application must be having JDK 9 plus, and the vulnerability version should be this. So the Spring framework must be having either less than 5.2 or either of these two versions. Or the next condition is Apache Tomcast as a server for Spring application packaged as web archives. Here is another condition. And also, it must be having the dependency on Spring Web MVC framework, sorry, the component, and also the Spring Web Flux component of the Spring framework. And it is worth nothing, however, that these may change over the time. They are also mentioning here, like a disclaimer, these conditions might be changing in future based on the further exploitation techniques that we are detecting. And here they gave the remediation at the bottom. Fortunately, the patched versions of the Spring framework have been released. To remediate the Spring4Shell, ensure that you are using a version of Spring released after patch 18 of minor releases 5.3, or after patch 20 if you are using minor release 5.2. Upgrading the version of the framework is enough to remove the vulnerability from your application. They also gave the remediation step, which is very, very simple. If you are yet to patch this vulnerability, then do it immediately because it is very critical and very notorious flaw. If upgrading is not possible, they also gave some workarounds here. And if I go to this specific link, I'll be able to witness what are all the mitigations they gave. So here is the time window. They just gave what happened in each time window. First of all, March 31st, they actually disclosed this specific flaw. And if I scroll down a little bit further, I'll be able to understand what this vulnerability is all about. And if you have a question, am I impacted? You can read this. They gave this criteria. We already seen this criteria. So they gave the same here. And also the additional notes they gave, the vulnerability involves class loader access. I'm not very much familiar with Java, hence I'm just moving these things, by seeing it just a high level. And therefore, in addition to the specific attack reported to Tomcat specific class loader, other attacks may be possible against the different custom class loader. They're mentioning this term class loader here, and also they gave the suggested workarounds. So the preferred response is to update the Spring framework. However, if you have any constraints in upgrading this, you have the workarounds as well. Upgrading the Tomcat. So without touching the Spring framework, you can modify these versions to have the temporary mitigations against this. You can either upgrade the Tomcat version or you can downgrade the version to Java 8. As we said, the Java JDK 9 and above are vulnerable to this. You can simply downgrade it to 8. And also the third one, disallowed fields. So I'm opening this link once again. So here I can see the disallowed fields. Another viable workaround is to disable binding to particular fields by setting disallowed fields on web data binder globally. If you see this specific piece of code, you will be able to understand. So here they gave the web data binder piece of code, and within this, they simply created an object deny list. Within the object, the members are class dot asterisk and also the class dot asterisk. So they are simply mentioning the pattern here, and they are simply calling this object within the set disallowed fields function as an argument. So that is what the piece of code here. So it can be disabled with this piece of code. And if I scroll down further, they just gave the same in the whole code. And just scrolling down, they also gave the Tomcat version, which version you have to upgrade. And downgrading to Java, it is also one of the ways to mitigate this flaw. And if I scroll down further, they just gave some information, and also finally the comment section. All right. Now, so this is the overall high level view of this specific vulnerability. Before we are moving to the exploitation part, I just want you to showcase few other blocks that is related to Spring4Shell, because the exploitation phase is very easy and it only takes few seconds, as I said. So we just try to walk through the other blogs about this. You can see this Lunasec blog. The Lunasec is the one who informed about the Log4Shell vulnerability for the very first time. Similarly, the Spring4Shell also being informed by this Lunasec community, and security analysis of the latest Java remote code execution 0-day vulnerabilities in the Spring. All right, now let's see what it is. Two series vulnerabilities, as I said before. One is affecting Spring Core, another is affecting Spring Cloud Functions. And who is impacted? Anyone using Spring on Java 9 or newer. All right, and also using the Tomcat. They must be using the Tomcat. And these two vulnerabilities, they simply explained about this. And if I scroll down further, they gave the history of this vulnerability. Spring4Shell. On March 29, 2022, a set of tweets, now deleted actually, were published from a Chinese Twitter account showing screenshot of a new POC 0-day exploit in the popular Java library Spring Core. It is being referred to as Spring4Shell or Spring Shell. And the CVE was added on March 31st only, and they only allocated the CVE ID on March 31st. So before 2 days itself, an anonymous Chinese Twitter account released the POC and applying the mitigation. So they also released the mitigation on March 31st itself. So if I scroll down further, I can see the similar piece of code here. So the web data binder, within that, they are creating an object called deny list, and they are putting all those strings within the deny list, and they are calling that object as an argument in date set disallowed fields. So if I scroll down further, the same stuff given. And by going through the specific flaw in that Spring Core code, they also created their own application, and they gave the link here, the GitHub link here. So I'll be adding this specific URL, the Lunasec blog here, URL in the video description. You will be able to go through that the specific blog in detail. And I can scroll down further. They just try to explain about this vulnerability in clear manner. And this is about the Lunasec blog. And moving to the next one, the next blog by Praetorian, and the Spring Core on JDK 9 Plus is vulnerable to remote code execution. And this blog published on March 30th. So if I scroll down further, they gave the same sort of code here. So everything, the same content they give. They're just adding the specific strings within the set allowed fields, and they are calling it as an object, as an argument within the set allowed fields function. Yeah, so this is what this link as well. And as I said, this vulnerability is very, very critical. The recent blog from Trend Micro says it is already being exploited by threat actors. So this blog is totally discuss about that specific exploitation. You can see the title here, analyzing the exploitation of Spring4Shell vulnerability in weaponizing and executing the Mirai botnet malware. So this is the malware which is currently utilizing the vulnerability. And if I scroll down, they gave the simple explanation about the Spring framework and the vulnerability. Here they gave the difference between the two vulnerabilities that we discussed. And if I scroll down, I can see they analyze the patch and the exploit. If I scroll down further, here is the exploit code. Here they are defining the header, and also they are classifying, they are simply defining the data object. And this is the object actually. You can see the %25, percentage 7b, C2, percentage 70. So these are all the URL encoded stuff. So we will be able to decode this thing. So let me scroll on further. When we are reviewing the exploit code, I will explain this clearly. If I scroll down further, I'll be able to witness the exploitation. So here you can look at the specific URL, the active exploitation. Actually, here is the URL where where they are trying to execute some code. So you can ask, from where did you receive this specific URL? I'll explain from where we are getting this specific URL. Further, we need to look at the exploit code. So let's jump into this try hack me exploitation stage. So from here we will be able to understand from where we got that specific URL. So let's see the specific part, downloading the exploit. So let me download this file. And let me try to unzip this exploit. It is asking me the password, and the password is nothing but try hack me 123 exclamation. Yeah, we did that. Now I can see a Python file that is the actual exploit. So if I open this specific exploit, uh, here I can see literally few lines. It only contains 43 lines. And let me enable the word wrap. Yeah, now I can see the whole stuff here. But before explaining the specific exploit, let's see what we are having here. So this is just a procedure to download the exploit. Either we can download it here, or you can connect the machine simply and you can move to the specific path to download the exploit. And let's see the exploit here. The exploitation phase is very, very simple. Once they got this Python exploit file, they are simply trying to get the help, and they are just passing the specific target URL. Target URL is nothing but the specific machine which is vulnerable to Spring4Shell. And they are passing this URL as an argument, and finally they are getting the URL. So let's see what we exactly got here. The script requires one argument URL. This specifies the target for the post request. The other three optional arguments can be ignored in the current context. Let's start by taking a look at the web server in the browser. We can easily find our target URL by checking the source code of the website homepage. And specifically, we are looking for the action of the contact form. The only post request is available to us. This is found on line 20. So in order to exploit this vulnerability, there must be some uh, uh, place where we can send a post request. And for that, they are just trying to explain. So let's move to the specific URL. Here we can see the web server. And if I go to this specific page source, I can see the specific line here, which denotes the action. The action is just a forward slash, which means the whole website URL, and the method is post. So here I can see the whole website is using the post method. Hence, we are just going to exploit this. So let's try to explain this. Here you can see how they are exploiting this. They are simply calling the script and passing the URL as an argument. And once the URL exploit is succeed against this URL, it is simply giving us the URL back. So here you can see the URL shared by the web server, and you can see uh, the object here, cmd equal to a random command. So you can see the command whoami, it is a Linux command to find the current user. And similarly, instead of this whoami, you can use any Linux command that you want. So it will eventually give the specific URL that you need to try. So we were talking about the URL, right, when we were discussing about this exploitation. So this is where we receive the URL. Once you test the exploit against the specific target, you will be getting the URL. Once you got the URL, you can simply add the command that you need. You can simply append the command and you can try this specific URL against your target. Eventually, this command will be executed on your target web server. So if you see the command here, you will get to understand. The CMD equal to CD percentage 20. You may ask the question, what is %20? I will try to explain this. Here I can see the URL encoder and decoder online. So the %20, I'm just trying to decode it. If I decode, I'm getting nothing. So let me explain once again. I'm keeping the cursor here. Now I'm giving a space simply and I'm trying to encode it. If I try to encode, I'm getting %20. So the %20 is nothing but a space, a simple space in URL encoding technique. So what they are doing, they are simply executing cd space /tmp. They are simply opening the temp directory, and for the space they are denoting it as %20 since they are trying it as a URL. And semicolon is to break the line, and they are giving the %20 once again, and this time wget once again the space and http a specific URL, and you can see the semicolon here. So they break this line with this. So here you can see the URL. Actually, they defanged the URL. So though you try the URL directly in this format, it won't work. And I can see the next one, chmod. They are simply modifying the specific file. I think if you try this URL with the wget command, it will be downloading the payload, and they are modifying the privilege for the payload. They are simply giving 777, which means read, write, execute, all the access. And the next command is they are simply executing the specific file. So this is what they are doing, just a single line. From with this single line, they are downloading the payload from the C2 server, and they are also changing its privilege, and they are also executing the specific malware. So that is why we are saying this specific vulnerability is very, very notorious. And if I go here, uh, nothing they gave apart from this. So let me try to explain that specific exploit that we received. So here you can see it is Python code. It is built on Python 3. Import request. They are importing the request library for sending the web request, and they are importing the arg parse library. This is to define the arguments in this specific code. And the URL library from URL lib.parse, they are importing function called URL join. And here they are defining a function called exploit. And look at the arguments of this function: URL, file name, password, and directory. And if you see the header, they simply crafted this header. For the suffix, they gave this as a value, and for C1, they gave the value as runtime. For C2, this is the value, and for D and T, they simply define the value as 1. And the content type, so this is the content type. And if I scroll down further, they are defining an object called data, and they are also defining they are just crafting the value for this data. So this is the data that they are going to send to that specific vulnerable web server. And here I can see among all those human readable letter, I can also see some URL encoded string. So in order to decode, I'm simply using the same website once again. I left CL here, moving to URL encoder and decoder. So once I decode, I can see the decoder string. If you see here, you can identify class dot module class loader. So it is calling class loader resources context parent pipeline dot first dot pattern, and here they are calling C2. If you see the C2 above, you can see its value. It's nothing but you can see here the value. And if password equals to request dot get parameter pwd, they're just defining a, they're just defining a condition here, and java.io.input stream, and they are defining ci here. They're just calling the ci. And if I see further, I can witness suffix here, and the suffix is nothing but this one. So this is what is all about this encoded data object. So let's see what next. And here they are defining the try method, the try and except block. Actually, in the try block, they are just trying to post the specific request against the URL that we give. Actually, we are going to pass this URL as an argument. This will be our target URL, and the headers are nothing but we already created, and also the data. So we are just going to use the headers and data against the URL. And apart from this, in the next line, they are simply using the URL join function. So this function is to create the URL once they posted all these crafted data into the target web server. And I will explain this URL format. If you go here, you can see the URL format. First, they are giving the URL and the file name .jsp. So if I come here, file name .jsp and the URL, they are simply concatenating all these three things here, and shell.go. And the next thing is sending request to the shell URL, and if the shell URL is reachable, then it will print the specific thing to the user. So first of all, it will try to frame the URL until this JSP thing. After that, if the specific URL is reachable, then only it will append this specific parameters and display this thing to the user. And if the specific URL is not reachable, if the target is not vulnerable to Spring4Shell, then you will get this as a response. So this is what all about the exploit. If I see further, it is simply the argument definition. I will tell you what is argument definition. First of all, let me move to the specific path. Python 3 exploit --help. If I give this, I can see its man page. So here is the definition: Spring4Shell RECE proof of concept, positional argument, URL. Actually, that is what they defined here: Spring4Shell RCE proof of concept, and the URL, file name, password, directory, and they give what are these arguments and its definition. All right, now let's move to this. I will try to exploit this specific flaw, Python 3, and it is very simple. I'm just calling my exploit and the URL that I need to try, and the URL is nothing but this is the URL. And let me go here, and I'm just passing the URL as an argument. Pressing enter. Now I can see the outcome. Shell uploaded successfully. Your shell can be found at this specific URL. Actually, this specific exploit found this URL till.jsp is reachable. Then it appended these parameters as well and shared it as a URL to the person who is trying to exploit. So yeah, I simply copied. So all we need is to try the URL directly. If I try the URL, I can see the specific user is root. And just executing commands within the specific server. I can also try the other commands. Present working directory, it is root directory, and what else I can do? Let me try to read its fastwd file. Why don't I do that? In order to do that, doing I'm just using the cat command and percentage 20 for denoting the space and forward slash etc fastwd. If I click enter, I can see the content of the server's fastwd file, and you can also execute any command that you want. But what we need in this case, we need the specific content of the file. We need to get into the root directory and the flag.txt, and we need the content of the file. So instead of trying the specific passwd, I'm simply going to get the content of the flag file. So here is the flag. If I enter this flag, that's it. We did it. And this is just the procedure. In the previous thing, it is just an advisory, so I'm just completing that as well. And what is next? Use your web shell to obtain reverse or bind shell on the target. So you can also try this on your own. You can get the reverse shell string on the website. There are abundance of resources, so you can just try to execute those commands against this web server, and you can try to get the reverse shell to your personal machine. And with this, I'm just completing. Moving to the conclusion part, this is just an information. We successfully accomplished, we successfully learned this vulnerability at high level. And as mentioned previously, this vulnerability has potential to be very widespread, but only time will tell how serious it truly is. Keep an eye out and make sure that the patch any systems that you are responsible for. So that is what even I am trying to insist. So if you're having any system that is unpatched to this vulnerability, try to patch this immediately. And there are other blocks they gave, but fortunately we gone through all these blocks before while explaining the vulnerability background. Yeah, with this, we have just accomplished the specific Spring4Shell room. And yes, this is what I wanted to explain. Hope you really learned something new from this. If you really did, consider liking this video and subscribing my channel. If you have any opinion, put it in the comment section. You can also share this video among your friends. And if you haven't patched this Spring4Shell vulnerability, go and patch this vulnerability immediately, because this vulnerability is very notorious. And yeah, I'll catch you next time with another excellent and exciting video. Until then, I'm signing off. Cheers and love you guys.